Condemned to Death, the Story of Zephen Xaver and the Sebring Bank Massacre. On January 23, 2019, a sense of horror blanketed the quiet town of Sebring, Florida. Zephen Xaver, a former correctional officer trainee, entered a SunTrust bank located on the outskirts of this peaceful community. Armed and driven by reasons still unclear to many, Xaver forced 5 innocent people to the floor before executing them in cold blood. The murders, chillingly devoid of motive, left both the victims, families, and an entire community grappling with profound grief and unanswered questions. Xaver didn't steal any money. He didn't target specific individuals. The authorities, after thorough investigations, determined the killings to be random, a rarity even in the increasingly familiar context of mass shootings in the United States. So what drives a person to commit such a senseless act of violence? Was it mental illness, a deep, unresolved pain, or something even more unfathomable? These questions form the foundation of our discussion today. At just 21 years old at the time of the crime, Zephen Xaver had already experienced significant turmoil and instability in his life. His defense would later describe a history of troubled relationships within his family, alleged emotional and physical abuse. This, compounded by unresolved mental health problems, painted the portrait of a deeply disturbed individual. Court records and interviews revealed that Xaver seemed fascinated with violence. Friends and acquaintances recalled him talking about dreams of harming others. Yet there was no substantial intervention before the Sebring massacre occurred. While his personal history points to a troubled and unstable mind, it also raises the haunting question: could this tragedy have been prevented if there had been more significant support or oversight? On the fateful day, Xaver entered the SunTrust bank carrying a handgun. He quickly took control, ordered employees and customers to the floor, and mercilessly pulled the trigger. When law enforcement received the distress call, negotiations were attempted. However, Xaver had made up his mind. He later surrendered, leaving behind a heartbreaking scene. 5 lives, each with their own stories, loved ones, and dreams, were cut short due to his senseless actions. The randomness of the crime confounded investigators. There was no robbery attempt, no grievances aired, and no manifesto explaining the actions. This absence of clear motive challenged even the most seasoned law enforcement officials and criminal psychologists, leaving the case to be defined as violence for violence's sake. The legal proceedings against Zephen Xaver were as complex as they were significant. Initially, Xaver pleaded not guilty, but in 2023 he revised his position, changing his plea to guilty. His admission of guilt, coupled with a letter of apology submitted to the court, became a focal point of the trial. This seemingly remorseful act raised questions. Was the apology genuine, or was it a calculated move intended to influence sentencing? Xaver's defense leaned heavily on his mental health struggles and abusive upbringing, arguing that these factors contributed significantly to his inability to control violent impulses. While such arguments highlight the importance of addressing mental health as part of criminal justice reform, they also widen the debate about culpability. Should someone with severe mental health issues be considered fully responsible for such heinous crimes? In part, this case gained national attention because it intersected with a landmark change in Florida's death penalty law. Previously, a unanimous jury vote was required to recommend the death penalty. However, changes in 2023 reduced that requirement to a minimum of 8 jurors out of 12. In Xaver's case, the jury met this new threshold, recommending the death penalty. The judge, bound by the verdict, sentenced the 26-year-old to death. While this outcome brought closure to some of the victims' families, it reignited broader debates about the morality and efficacy of capital punishment, particularly in cases where mental health plays a role. One of the most polarizing aspects of Xaver's case was the defense's focus on his mental health issues. Psychological experts testified that Xaver suffered from long-standing conditions, including depression and potential personality disorders. Coupled with his history of abuse, this painted a tragic image of a person deeply scarred and out of control. Yet critics argue that mental health struggles, no matter how severe, cannot absolve someone of accountability for their actions. especially when those actions result in the senseless murder of innocent lives. The jury's decision, many believe, reflected a desire to prioritize justice for the victims over sympathy for the perpetrator's troubled past. Still, others question whether the criminal justice system adequately addresses cases where mental illness potentially plays a central role. Could early intervention have prevented Xaver's actions? Is the death penalty appropriate when rehabilitation might theoretically be possible? These questions remain unanswered, but are profoundly relevant as similar cases continue to arise nationally. Most violent acts have some identifiable motive: revenge, profit, or ideological beliefs. Xaver's crime, however, was striking in its randomness. He had no personal connection to the victims, no financial incentive, and no declared ideological agenda. This randomness heightens the case's disturbing nature. It challenges our perceptions of safety, shattering the illusion that violence is something predictable or avoidable if we take the right precautions. It also pushes us to consider a more unsettling question: what are the triggers in society that allow such seemingly aimless violence to fester and erupt? Criminal psychologists suggest that in the absence of clear motives, crimes like Xaver's often stem from an internal sense of isolation, anger, or a desire for notoriety. While these insights offer some understanding, they do little to alleviate the grief and confusion left in the wake of such tragedies. Following the Sebring Massacre, the local community rallied together, holding vigils and memorials to honor the 5 lives lost. The pain of the families and survivors became a collective burden for Sebring's residents, who struggled to reconcile the sheer randomness of the violence with their previously peaceful existence. Calls for reform echoed in the aftermath. Some advocated for stricter gun laws, while others focused on improving mental health services to address warning signs like those exhibited by Xaver before the attack. However, debates over which preventive measures would be most effective have remained inconclusive, reflecting the broader, unresolved national conversation on these issues. The Sebring case holds broader implications for the American criminal justice system. Firstly, it underscores the need to identify and intervene in cases where individuals exhibit signs of escalating mental instability and violent tendencies. Secondly, it highlights the complexities of sentencing laws, especially as they relate to the death penalty. The moral and ethical debates over capital punishment are as alive as ever, especially when juxtaposed with issues of mental illness and rehabilitation. Critics argue that giving the state the power to carry out executions is fraught with risks of error and moral failings. Supporters, meanwhile, counter that justice for victims and public safety must take precedence. Finally, the randomness of the murders challenges us to better understand the unpredictability of violence and how to foster a society where such acts are less likely to occur. Can assessing potential threats ever truly mitigate the danger of crimes like this? Or are we ultimately left grappling with the darker, less predictable aspects of human nature? The sentencing of Zephen Xaver raises profound ethical questions. On one hand, the victims' families and the community at large demanded justice, a form of closure for the unimaginable pain inflicted upon them. On the other hand, Xaver's troubled background invites uncomfortable questions about how society addresses individuals who are products of trauma and mental illness. Moreover, the use of Florida's death penalty in this case has produced mixed reactions. While some view it as a justified penalty for such an egregious crime, others see it as a failure to acknowledge the complexities of Xaver's mental state. This tension illuminates deeper divides in how society perceives justice, fairness, and punishment. Zephen Xaver's case is one of piercing tragedy and unresolved questions. Through his actions, he left 5 families shattered and a community grieving, along with lingering questions about what could have been done to prevent such a senseless act. From a judicial perspective, his sentencing marks a milestone in Florida's legal history, setting a precedent that will undoubtedly inform for future cases. Beyond the courtroom, however, the random nature of his actions serves as a sobering reminder of the unpredictable threats that exist in society and the need to address underlying causes before they escalate into unspeakable violence. For true crime enthusiasts, this case transcends its sensational headlines, offering glimpses into the deeper cracks within the human psyche and the justice system. As we reflect on this story, we return to the central questions it raises. How can society balance justice with compassion? Is punishment sufficient when prevention fails? And most importantly, how do we ensure that tragedies like Sebring have no repeat in the years to come?